What if I told you that there was a gospel so dangerous, so revolutionary, that it could have completely rewritten the history of Christianity as we know it? A gospel so threatening that the most powerful institution on earth, the Catholic Church, spent centuries hunting down every copy, silencing every voice, and destroying every trace of its existence? But here's the thing, they failed, and what survived will shock you. Historical note: we'll be exploring documented archaeological findings and examining multiple scholarly perspectives throughout this journey. I'm about to reveal to you a story that has been buried for over 1,500 years, a story of forbidden knowledge, underground preservation efforts, and texts that challenged established religious authority. By the end of this video, you'll understand why certain early Christian writings were considered threatening to institutional power, and why modern scholars continue to debate their significance. But before we dive in, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now, because if you find this historical investigation as fascinating as I think you will, you're going to want to see what other archaeological discoveries we explore on this channel. We always present multiple scholarly viewpoints and primary source evidence. In the next 40 minutes, we're going to explore not just what these ancient texts contained, but who wrote them, how they survived through underground preservation networks, and most importantly, what modern scholarship tells us about their historical significance and continuing influence. The mystery unveiled early Christian world. Picture this. It's the 4th century CE. The Roman Empire is transforming. Christianity is spreading rapidly across Europe and North Africa, and in the midst of this religious revolution, something extraordinary was happening. Multiple versions of Christian teaching were circulating, not just from official church sources, but from diverse early Christian communities with varying interpretations. These weren't just different religious manuscripts. Some contained theological concepts that challenged the developing Orthodox Christian doctrine in fundamental ways. But what exactly was in these alternative texts that concerned church authorities? Now, before I tell you what these texts contained, I want you to think about something historically. What would make religious authorities in any era concerned about alternative interpretations of their founding texts? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious about your historical perspective. The texts I'm referring to aren't found in your standard Bible. They're not Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. These writings, discovered by archaeologists and studied by scholars for decades, presented different theological frameworks entirely. While the canonical Gospels that became orthodox emphasized salvation through church sacraments and hierarchical structure, these alternative texts spoke of more direct spiritual approaches. Direct spiritual experience, minimal institutional mediation, personal gnosis, meaning direct knowledge or experience of the divine. Consider the historical implications. What happens when religious movements emphasize individual spiritual authority over institutional control? What happens to established religious hierarchies, elaborate ceremonial systems, and centralized spiritual authority? Church historians document exactly what happened. And that's why Orthodox authorities initiated systematic campaigns against these texts and their communities. But who actually wrote these alternative Gospels? And what archaeological evidence do we have for their existence? The origins and the authors. Here's where modern scholarship gets really fascinating, and I promise you, the archaeological evidence will surprise you. Stay with me, because what I'm about to share challenges many popular assumptions about early Christian uniformity. To understand these texts academically, we need to examine the historical evidence. The period from 50 to 200 CE saw remarkable diversity in early Christian communities. Contrary to later church teachings suggesting unified early doctrine, archaeological and textual evidence reveals significant theological diversity. Now, Orthodox Christianity wants us to believe there were only 4 legitimate Gospels, divinely inspired and perfectly preserved. But here's what modern biblical scholarship has documented. In those early centuries, scholars have identified evidence for dozens of different Christian texts. Some focused on Jesus' teachings, others on mystical experiences, and some contained theological frameworks that differed substantially from what became Orthodox doctrine. The authors of these alternative texts, and this is documented in the texts themselves, claimed various forms of apostolic authority. Some claimed direct discipleship, others claimed to preserve secret teachings, and still others presented theological interpretations based on mystical experiences. Modern scholars debate these claims using historical critical methods, examining linguistic evidence, cultural context, and manuscript traditions. Now, I can see some of you are probably thinking, how do we know this is historically accurate? What's the actual evidence? And that's exactly the right question to ask. Drop a comment if you're thinking the same thing. Here's what archaeological evidence tells us. In December 1945, near Nag Hammadi in Egypt, local residents made one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in modern religious studies. 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 texts, many of which had been lost for over a millennium. Among these were alternative gospels that Orthodox Christianity had worked to suppress. But here's what's scientifically verifiable. Carbon dating and paleographic analysis indicate that some of these manuscript copies date to the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Some may preserve traditions that are contemporary with or even earlier than the canonical gospel traditions. This means the theological diversity we see wasn't a later deviation. It may represent original Christian plurality. So what exactly did these texts teach that differed so significantly from Orthodox Christianity? What theological concepts were considered problematic enough to require systematic suppression? The answer reveals fundamental questions about religious authority that remain relevant today. The alternative teachings. What I'm about to share represents documented theological concepts from ancient texts that scholars have spent decades translating and analyzing. These aren't modern interpretations. These are historically documented alternatives to Orthodox Christian doctrine. The first significant theological difference found in texts like the Gospel of Thomas was the concept of the divine spark, the idea that humans possess inherent spiritual potential rather than requiring external salvation. This wasn't just philosophical speculation. It represented a fundamentally different understanding of human nature and spiritual development. Consider the institutional implications of this theology. If individuals possess inherent spiritual capacity, then religious institutions serve more as guides than as essential intermediaries. This theological framework naturally decentralizes religious authority. Pause for a moment and consider this historically. How might such theological concepts affect the development of religious institutions? How might they influence individual spiritual practice? Drop your historical analysis below. This is important for understanding religious development. The second major theological difference, documented in texts like the Gospel of Philip, was an emphasis on present spiritual transformation rather than future salvation. These texts taught that spiritual fulfillment was achievable through current practice and understanding, not through future reward systems. Examine what this means for traditional Christian eschatology. It shifts focus from institutional promises about afterlife outcomes to individual spiritual development in the present moment. This theological framework reduces institutional control over spiritual destiny. But perhaps the most institutionally challenging teaching found in these texts was the concept of universal spiritual potential. The idea that Jesus' role was to demonstrate, rather than exclusively provide, spiritual transformation. Texts like the Gospel of Mary suggest that others could achieve similar spiritual development. Consider the historical implications if this theological framework had become dominant in early Christianity. Religious hierarchies might have developed very differently. The emphasis might have remained on spiritual practice and development rather than institutional authority and doctrinal compliance. Now you can understand why Orthodox authorities were concerned. This wasn't just different biblical interpretation. This represented a fundamentally different model of religious organization and spiritual development. But how did church authorities respond to this theological challenge? The institutional response. What happened next is well documented in church historical records. The Orthodox Christian response wasn't just theological debate. It was a coordinated institutional campaign to establish doctrinal uniformity. In 367 CE, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria issued his famous 39th Festal Letter, a historically documented watershed moment in Christian orthodoxy. This letter officially established the 27-book New Testament canon and explicitly condemned alternative texts as heretical. But ecclesiastical condemnation was only the beginning. What followed represents one of history's most systematic campaigns for doctrinal uniformity. Church authorities, supported by imperial power after Constantine's conversion, initiated widespread efforts to locate and destroy alternative Christian texts. Historical records document the thoroughness of this campaign. The consequences for individuals and communities are documented in church histories and imperial records. Possession of condemned texts resulted in excommunication, exile, or worse. Communities suspected of harboring alternative theological views faced dissolution. Scholars who studied these texts faced professional and personal persecution. Consider the documented case of Priscillian of Avila in 385 CE. Historical records show he was a Spanish bishop who taught theological concepts similar to those found in the Nag Hammadi texts, emphasis on direct spiritual experience, critique of excessive church hierarchy, and individual spiritual development. He became the first documented case of execution for heresy in Christian history. But here's a crucial historical question. If Orthodox doctrine was so obviously correct, and these alternatives so clearly wrong, why did they require such extensive institutional suppression? Shouldn't theological truth be able to prevail through intellectual debate? What do you think historical evidence suggests? Drop your analysis in the comments. But here's where historical documentation becomes really fascinating. Despite systematic suppression efforts, these texts didn't disappear completely. Instead, archaeological evidence suggests they were preserved through underground networks of individuals who risked everything to maintain theological diversity. Who were these preservation networks? How did they manage to maintain alternative texts under such systematic suppression? And most importantly, what archaeological evidence confirms their success? The underground preservation networks. The preservation story I'm about to tell you is documented through archaeological evidence, manuscript studies, and historical research. Every detail comes from scholarly investigation of actual historical evidence. As institutional suppression intensified, archaeological evidence suggests something remarkable happened. Networks of scribes, scholars, and theologians developed sophisticated preservation methods across the Mediterranean world. Modern scholars refer to these preservation communities by various names, but they're often categorized as early Gnostic communities, those who emphasized gnosis, or direct spiritual knowledge. In locations from Egypt to France, from Syria to Ireland, archaeological evidence reveals hidden chambers, concealed libraries, and sophisticated manuscript preservation techniques. Each preserved text represents enormous risk and demonstrates the value these communities placed on theological diversity. These preservation networks, based on archaeological evidence, developed remarkable methods for hiding their work. Researchers have discovered false walls in libraries, manuscripts buried in sealed ceramic containers, and complex coding systems that disguised alternative theological content within apparently orthodox texts. The network operated according to historical evidence, like an ancient information preservation system. When scribes finished copying texts, they would pass copies to trusted contacts in other regions. Gradually, manuscripts spread across continents. Documented finds show preservation efforts from Egypt to Western Europe, from North Africa to the British Isles. Many preservationists paid severely for their efforts. Historical records document cases like Hypatia of Alexandria, a mathematician and philosopher who preserved many alternative texts, who was killed by a Christian mob in 415 CE. In 529 CE, Emperor Justinian's closure of the Academy of Athens forced scholars to flee to Persia with their manuscripts. But somehow, against systematic suppression, the texts survived, hidden in desert caves, sealed in monastery walls, buried in forgotten locations. Copies of alternative Christian texts waited in concealment for over a millennium. Until one documented day in 1945, when an Egyptian farmer searching for fertilizer made an archaeological discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of early Christian diversity. The modern archaeological discovery, the Nag Hammadi discovery. Muhammad Ali al-Saman, according to documented accounts, had no idea he was about to make one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in modern religious studies. He was searching for sabak, a type of soft soil used as fertilizer, when his tool struck something hard near Nag Hammadi, Egypt. What he discovered changed modern biblical scholarship permanently. 13 leather-bound codices sealed in a ceramic jar containing 52 texts that had been lost for over 1,500 years. Among them were alternative gospels attributed to Thomas, Philip, Mary Magdalene, and others, texts that had been systematically suppressed by Orthodox authorities. When international scholars gained access to these texts beginning in the 1970s, it revolutionized academic understanding of early Christianity. Here was documented proof that early Christian diversity was far greater than previously understood, with sophisticated theological alternatives to Orthodox doctrine. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, contains 114 documented sayings attributed to Jesus, many reflecting the theological concepts we've discussed. Quote, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." This represents documented alternative theological perspective. But here's what's particularly significant for contemporary religious studies. These ancient theological concepts resonate with modern spiritual movements. In our era of institutional questioning, emphasis on personal spiritual experience and individual spiritual development, these alternative Christian concepts seem remarkably contemporary. Consider modern spiritual movements, mindfulness practices, emphasis on personal spiritual experience over institutional doctrine, and the growing demographic of spiritual but not religious individuals. Whether consciously or not, many contemporary spiritual approaches echo theological concepts from these suppressed texts. Even within mainstream Christianity, you can trace influence from these rediscovered concepts: emphasis on personal relationship with divinity, questioning of excessive institutional authority, focus on inner spiritual transformation. All can be connected to theological alternatives that Orthodox Christianity once systematically suppressed. But this raises crucial questions for contemporary consideration. What does this historical evidence mean for current religious understanding? Are similar patterns of information control still operating today? And what can we learn from this ancient documentation about the relationship between institutional power and individual spiritual development? Modern implications and scholarly conclusions. The documented story of alternative Christian texts isn't just ancient history. It provides historical perspective on ongoing tensions between institutional authority and individual spiritual exploration. Today, We can observe similar patterns in various information control contexts, though the methods have evolved significantly. Consider contemporary examples: social media content moderation, academic peer review processes, mainstream media editorial decisions, and institutional gatekeeping in various fields. While methods have changed dramatically, the fundamental dynamic between established authority and alternative perspectives continues to operate in various forms. But the real historical lesson from these alternative Christian texts isn't specifically about religion. It's about documented human potential for diverse thinking and the historical tendency of institutions to prefer uniformity over diversity. It's about the historical importance of preserving alternative perspectives, even when they challenge established thinking. From a historical perspective, the suppressed texts suggest that early Christianity had room for theological diversity and individual spiritual development. Today, we can apply this historical lesson to our own critical thinking. We don't need to accept any single authority's interpretation of complex questions without examination. We can evaluate multiple perspectives and develop our own informed conclusions. So I want to leave you with this historically grounded question. What alternative perspectives might you be avoiding in your own thinking? What authorities are you allowing to limit your critical examination? What aspects of your own intellectual development might you be constraining because they don't align with established expectations? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your insights often inspire future historical investigations. And if this archaeological story opened your mind to new historical perspectives, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We're just getting started with exploring documented discoveries that challenge conventional historical narratives. Next week, we're investigating another suppressed historical topic that will fascinate you: the documented evidence behind the Salem witch trials and how it connects to historical patterns of social control and gender dynamics. You won't want to miss this evidence-based analysis. Remember, the greatest intellectual development comes from examining multiple perspectives and thinking critically about documented evidence. The alternative Christian texts teach us that spiritual and intellectual diversity has deep historical roots, and that's something worth preserving and exploring. Thanks for watching, fellow history enthusiasts. Keep questioning, keep investigating, and keep developing your own informed perspectives based on documented evidence.